I'll be back in a moment, and when we come back, I'm going to ask Eric Foner why the world history standards include a description of what happened at Hiroshima, but do not discuss the Buchanan death march, the rape of Nanking, or other things that led up to it. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Crossfire. We're talking about history. Conservatives are making a big hoo-ha about new history teaching standards sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. They say the standards pervert history by overplaying blacks and women and underplaying white males. And they have other complaints, too. Defenders of the standards say it's a bum rap and right-wing political correctness. Our guest, Lynne Cheney, she was director of the Humanities Endowment under George Bush and actually started the Standards Project. But she also started the fuss about the results. And joining us from New York, Professor Eric Foner, who teaches history at Columbia University. Pat. Eric Foner, as we know from our first segment here with Michael and Lynn and you, and me, history is a matter about which Americans care very passionately. Who are the villains? Who are the heroes? What are the important movements? What are the good movements? What are the evil ones? All the rest of it. And we are very, very polarized as a people. We're divided and broken up over this. Isn't this a very, very powerful argument for no national standards, but rather let local communities and towns and cities choose the history texts that they want their children to learn that reflect their beliefs about what is good or bad or great in American history and not have any federal standard imposed upon them?
That's a perfectly good argument, but these standards are voluntary standards. Nobody is imposing them on anyone. School boards can adopt them, they can not adopt them, they can change them. Teachers can use them in the classroom any way they want. You know, the teacher is the main educational resource in a classroom, not the textbook, not the standards. These standards are to help the teachers. And you know, teachers by the hundreds helped to produce these standards. They were not produced by some little cadre of people at UCLA. Hundreds of teachers had input into it, and they want these standards. They want advice. That's what these standards are. They are setting up a model. Nobody is imposing this. I would totally oppose the federal government imposing a uniform standard. These are voluntary, and students and...
I take your point.
That's the point. That's not a national...
He says, Lynn, these are voluntary, so what's the...
As the law is written now, there will be a federal commission that will approve these standards. They'll become a kind of official knowledge thereby, even though there are now a number of important moves to get rid of that certifying agency.
You started this. You just don't like the result.
The contract that I signed for these standards promised a very different product from the one that was delivered. The contract that I signed for these standards promised a history that would tell us about the traditional heroes as well as about the new history coming in.
You have complaints about the results, but you don't agree with Pat that the whole thing is a bad idea.
Oh, I do now think that national standards in history are impossible. The very fact, as Mr. Foner pointed out, that hundreds of academics and teachers have been involved in this tells me that history study in the United States is now at a point where we cannot and should not have national standards.
That's nonsense. You see, she is this is this idea that the universities have been taken over by all sorts of radicals from the 60s. This is completely nonsense. Pat, why don't you come up to Columbia University? I'll introduce you to my students and my colleagues, and you'll see a diversity of opinion, and you'll meet people of all sorts of points of view.
Mr. Foner, I really have an important question to ask, since you're trying to make it seem as though the Academy is a place where we're still studying traditional history. You have written a dictionary of American history, a guidebook to American history, and I was looking in the index before I came on this show. There's not a single main entry for Columbus. However, there are main entries for the Chicago Seven. There is a main entry for Betty Friedan. There is a main entry for Gloria
By the way, I didn't
Steinem.
write that. I edited it with my colleague, Professor Garrity.
Well, I find it very odd that Columbus doesn't get a main entry,
Miss Cheney, this is the bean counting approach.
Names.
This is not how you study history. This is why students...
priorities.
By the way, Columbus is in the book. This is why students don't like history, because traditionally history has been taught in this way. Here's a great name. Here's a great name. Here's a date. This is what's important in history. Robert E. Lee. Not the strategy of the Civil War, but how many times we can count Robert E. Lee. Not the Bill of Rights, but whether George Washington as president is mentioned. But my problem with the critics is they are trying to go back to this old history. What they want is a feel-good history. What Ms. Cheney says in her is that these are grim. She said these are grim. They are depressing. Pat, you know, one of the things she cited in her Wall Street Journal article as being grim was that students are asked to
Foner,
analyze your speech to the 1992 Republican National Convention.
Eric, hold on. Okay, Lynn, then I got a question for you.
Well, the point is what we want is a history that tells the story of all of the American people. We want a history that tells the story of George Washington and Robert E. Lee as well, and all of our scientists. There is no science in these standards. Einstein's not in here, Edison's not in here, Alexander Graham Bell is not in here.
High school students are required to know about how inventions changed the way people lived and worked in the late 19th century.
The scientists aren't in here. The scientists aren't in here.
They're not mentioned by name, but the standards require people to know about the invention.
All the other names are in there. Harriet Tubman.
What if Martin...
Why are you so obsessed with Harriet Tubman?
But Michael, what if Martin Luther King Jr. were not in here? You would be upset, I would be upset, and we should be.
If it said students were required to know about the roots of the civil rights movement, etc., I wouldn't care less if his name was mentioned.
Well, then
not a text.
Then that is a great mistake on your part.
What do you care about that? You like Joe McCarthy. I got a question for Lynn on a slightly different subject. You and William Bennett have both called for the National Endowment for the Humanities to be abolished.
That's true.
You both used to head it. Now, during the time you headed it, you certainly didn't call for its abolition. In fact, you flew all around the country on taxpayer money saying how wonderful it was. Aren't you being a little bit hypocritical now that the party line has changed? You've changed with it?
The National Endowment for the Humanities has done many good things, which I still talk about, and I talked about then. What I don't like is when people have some romantic view of what the endowments, either the Endowment for the Arts or the Endowment for the Humanities, has done. My good friend Charlton Heston has a romantic view. Absolutely. I want people to have a realistic view of what it's doing.
We got to get Eric Foner.
Michael, we are having a new national conversation now about the role of government.
When she can control them and when her people control them. When other people
control them, they want them abolished.
Conversation. The American people told us on November 8th, 1994.
So you changed your mind because of the election.
Listen, the American people said,
you were head of the endowment. You never called for it to be abolished.
Sit down and think about the right role of the federal government. There is no role for the federal government here.
You never sat down and thought about it while you for all the years you were heading it?
Michael, I had great conversations with Milton Friedman about this. My job running that agency was to do as good a job as I could. And now that we are having a national conversation about the role of government.
Eric Foner,
it's not weak, Michael.
I want to get to the question.
Can I just say something about this business? Let me get back to the standards, because as I said before, the problem is Ms. Cheney and all the other critics, they say these standards are depressing, they're grim, they want this feel-good history. They don't think that students can deal with complexity in American history. They don't think that students can deal with the fact that there are negative features of history as well as positive. My job as a history teacher is not to make feel good. If you want to feel good, go to a psychiatrist. If you want to learn about history, come to a historian.
All right, and if you want to be on television, you have to stop talking when there's a commercial.